Fun fact about me that you didn't know, I used to be a gymnast. Anyway, happy Friday everybody, welcome back. Today we're gonna talk about frame rates and the case for 24p. Let's go. People just kind of assume that more is better, so they'll just choose the highest frame rate their camera has. That may not be the best option for you. So first of all, what is a frame rate? Well, it's actually quite a simple definition. It's the number of pictures per second, or the number of frames that your camera takes per unit time, in this case, seconds. If you set your camera to 24p or 24 frames per second, that means your camera's taking 24 pictures in 1 second. It's as simple as that. You're gonna ask, well, what frame rate should I choose? And my answer to that would be choose 24p, 24 frames per second. But Chris, my camera shoots all these high frame rates. Why wouldn't I just choose higher because bigger is better? Not necessarily. So back in the day, 24 frames per second was the standard, and it basically has been carried into modern day times through Hollywood and through cinema. And along with movies, you get big budgets, nice lighting, great acting, good scripts, good audio. You're getting all of these other factors that make the film look expensive. So in your mind, you have already associated 24 frames per second with big budget Hollywood productions. News broadcasts are shot in 60 fields per second, 60i, or essentially 60 pictures per second. So if you choose 60 frames per second on your camera, you're gonna have a bit more of a real news broadcasty feel. Maybe that's what you're going for, but most people, if they're looking for a nice cinematic, expensive looking filmic type appearance, 24 frames per second will give you that. 60 frames per second looks like news broadcasts. 24 frames per second looks like expensive Hollywood film. More frames per second equals bigger files, so therefore you're gonna have to shell out more for storage. So if the lowest frame rate looks the best already, why just force a higher frame rate? That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. If you're only shooting 24p, then that also gives you another benefit, because any frame rates higher than 24 frames per second, i.e. 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second if your camera shoots it, will allow you to shoot in smooth slow motion. And that's true slow motion, or over cranking as they call it in the film world. So if I shoot, say, 60 frames per second, but I play it back at 24 frames per second, now I've got very smooth and cinematic slow motion. And that's the benefit of shooting 24 frames per second. It gives you the other frame rates as options to shoot true slow motion. A lot of you guys might come from a photography background, so concepts like ISO, shutter speed, aperture may be very familiar to you, and they mostly translate over to video in the same way, except shutter speed for some reason gets people. So I'm gonna break it down really simple here. Your shutter speed is applicable on a per frame basis. So let's say you had a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, and you're taking 24 images per second. Each frame will be exposed for 1/50th of a second. That's 1/50th, 1/50th, 1/50th for all the 24 frames in your 1 second of video. Shutter speed, for all intents and purposes, doesn't affect the number of frames per second. Now that we're talking about shutter speed, a lot of people wonder, what shutter speed should I choose in video? And a lot of people will actually just use the shutter speed to get the correct exposure, because that's what they're used to doing in photography. You can do that, but your motion might look a little bit strange, because shutter speed, as you're aware, affects motion blur. So just like when you're shooting photos and you open your shutter for a long time, you get those traffic streaks. The slower your shutter speed is in video, the more motion blur you get. For a frame rate of 24 frames per second, an ideal shutter speed will be 1/48th of a second, or most people's cameras will shoot 1/50th of a second, which is close enough. If you start getting into faster shutter speeds, your motion starts looking very jittery, and you can get very staccato looking images, which can be a creative choice. A lot of movies, for example, action and war scenes, they'll use a high shutter speed to really accentuate that grittiness. But for all intents and purposes, general good rule of thumb is double your frame rate and take the reciprocal. So for example, 24 frames per second times 2 would be 48, and then 1/48, that's 1/48th of a second. If you're shooting 60 frames per second, consider 1/20th of a second as your shutter speed. So if you're shooting video, you may realize that getting an exposure is a little bit more difficult than in photography, because your shutter speed is now being locked to more or less a single number. If you're shooting with a Sony a7S II in a log gamma, your ISO is going to be at the very minimum 1600. That's a very sensitive setting for your sensor. You've only got your shutter speed or your aperture left to deal with that. Well, we've just said that your shutter speed probably should be 1/50th of a second if you're shooting 24 frames per second, and that's also letting a lot of light in. So the only variable you have left is your aperture. And you're dealing with a lot of light, so you're all of a sudden just trying to stop down that aperture to something like f22. You're sacrificing depth of field, which is something that contributes a lot to a cinematic look. You're also showing every bit of dirt on your sensor, and furthermore, you're dealing with resolution loss because you're getting limited by diffraction. So that leaves us with another little secret tip that we have is using an ND filter. We're not gonna get too much into ND filters on today's video, but just think about an ND filter as sunglasses for your lens. It cuts down the light and gives you a fourth variable to adjust your exposure. So you can set your shutter speed, ISO, and aperture at optimal settings for your creative needs. If you have any questions, put them down below. We couldn't cover the whole topic in just a short video. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, and hit the bell so you're notified when we post new videos. Was that like Becky enough? Did I look like you?
You look like me. Where's your blue hair?
I need colored hair.
I'm just back here. I'm the teleprompter.
She's the teleprompter, yeah.